record. It's not doing anything.
Still doesn't.
Oh, it's actually just recording now.
Ah, okay. Well, yeah, it's yours. Your recording, I think, not mine. Oh well.
Well, I think
we can
yeah,
play around later.
Yeah, because no, I was just thinking that Iris also needs she needs the class to be done again. So since it's my fault with this recording thing, I'll just do another session for Katie and Iris this week. Yeah, and bring them up to speed. And the next class, I'll have the recording in place. All right. So reflect on class 1. We did that a little bit. Give me some feedback. Thank you. But just drop that anytime into the Slack as well. So yeah, on Slack, I was just hoping for a little bit more collaboration already. I mean, we spoke about a whole number of lenses the last time, but there weren't necessarily any questions or any thoughts or any books or anything like that. And the homework just got done like a day before. And I thought, that's kind of, we need to figure out ways to get a little bit more active on Slack. It's only for your benefit, so you can make maximum use of each other. But I think we're on the same page because Sia just said, how do we do this more? And I think it's only a matter of time before collaboration picks up anymore. So I'm glad you brought it up. I'll speak about that a little bit more towards the very end. Let's get into the specifics itself. Homework. It's interesting because this looked easy, but honestly, I struggle all the time as well with like which lenses work best. The average score you guys got was somewhere like 8 on 15, which I think is really good. And the homework was a little tricky in the sense that some of those were more than one category, and one was a complete fake. So it was definitely meant to give you some mental push-ups. So let's look at what the answers were. And I'll give you the clues as to how you can look at a piece of information, a book or a speech or an author's bio or their homepage and tell where they're coming from, like what discipline or what lens they're using. The first one, when you look at this, when you look at the word metaphor and how it shapes the way we see the world, you're talking about something like the subjective view. And metaphor is not something real. There is no real, like the brain is real, the hands are real, but the metaphor is a concept, right? And so the moment you look at anything like metaphor, subjective view, the self, all of these things, you're basically talking about the cognitive process where you're looking at what's going on inside the brain, you're looking at this feedback loop mechanism and so on. So that's a dead cue for, a strong cue for the first book. How emotions are made, well, how are they made? So as soon as you talk about the making of these things, how they are manufactured, especially if you talk about brain, you're talking about the body, which is neuroscience. Almost all the time, you can see that neuroscientists are speaking something about the manufacturing of stuff, chemicals, brain, neurons, etc. The third was pretty much everybody got that right. It's obvious. And the fourth was a bit tricky, but basically all choice architecture. You can just close your eyes. If someone says choice architecture, they're talking behavioral economics, they're talking nudging. It's always that when those two words come together. Oh, hello. Yep. Excellent. Oh, of course, Katie's here. Hi, Katie. Or yeah, nice. A lot of people got this one right, the most human, because I think the word artificial intelligence gave it away, and I think Brian Christian is a highly recommended author, but I'll come back to him later in the course as well. but most people got this one right. Again, the y-axis, hidden motives and the undiscovered economics of everyday life, behavioral economics. These guys on the top here who recommend the book Freakonomics, very famous authors, behavioral economics, also very clear why. This was the trick book, this triggers thing. I just put it there just to show you that as more and more pop psychology becomes even worse, like what can happen when you take something and make it even more superficial than pop? That's what this stuff is, in my view. It uses a very interesting title. I was definitely triggered by the title. And it said how behavior change begins, how to make it meaningful, how to make it last, had all the keywords. But actually, when you dig deeper into the author, there's very little depth there. And I will actually go into that a bit more. So this one was a trick one. All of you tried to answer it, good try. And obviously all of you lost a point here. Nobody got this right because you couldn't really say if it was from any discipline or all of them.
You sneaky thing, you have tricked us.
I know, expect these things. All these are exercises more than right or wrong. In fact, it's even impossible to say that, someone else can argue that some of these are slightly in another category, and it always happens. But the more you train, the better you get at being good. So then you have the magic of reality. Richard Dawkins.
Sorry, could we?
Yes,
could we just go back to the triggers, because when we supposed to judge the book by the cover and by what is written, wouldn't you agree that actually you could assign it to one of the lenses based on the text?
Absolutely, no doubt about it. I would probably put it in cognitive. If I was to discover it, I'd probably put it in cognitive. If I was just to see it on the bookshelf, I'd say in cognitive. But then I looked into the author, I read some, listened to some, I got the book, and then I looked, the book was just this anecdotal story after story of this and that, we did this, we did that. Like, where are the principles? Where is he coming from? And then I started to watch some of his videos, and then I was like, oh my God. He even spoke at Google, but anyways, I'm using that as the segue into the rest of today's presentation. Magic of reality. Dawkins is a biologist, and biology, body, neuroscience. Thinking in bets. Some people didn't get this right, but don't forget that behavioral economics, I told you, decision making. How to make decisions when you don't have all the facts. Decision making, uncertainty, bets, there's uncertainty. I don't have complete information. How do I make the best bet in order to maximize my returns? Very behavioral economics thinking. It's a very good book. It's a recommended book. I will recommend it later. But it's written in this really different style. She's actually a poker player, Annie Duke, and she uses a lot of lessons from poker. She's a good poker player, apparently. Cass Sunstein co-authored Nudge, the next book on the right. He co-authored Nudge with Richard Thaler. So that's a hardcore behavioral economics book. Even though Cass Sunstein is a lawyer, but I believe he's a behavioral economist for life. That's a behavioral economics book. Social Animal, not hard to guess. Very interesting book to read. Very nice to read on a holiday in a hammock, and sociology, socio-cultural view. Your behavior, that's another tricky one. It's actually, interestingly, even though it's got a lot of the cognitive view, it's actually a computational book. And it's the most edgy, one of the most edgy theories in behavioral science, called perceptual control theory or perception control theory. Perception control theory is essentially a type of control theory, and it's all about a sort of a computational approach to perception as to how we organize our view of the world, how we change our view of the world, how we behave to maintain our view of the world. Very computational approach, but it's still very fringe. They're like a small community still doing stuff, and only some mainstream people have picked up on them, but I will definitely get into them more later. So that was also very, very hard to get from the cover. That's exactly why I threw that in, just to kind of show you that it's not always straightforward. This is a brilliant one, Cyborgs. See, what the moment you look at I think a lot of people went for the computational view there because of the cyborg thing, but actually there's very little computation in the book. It's much more of a sociocultural view and a cognitive view. And the giveaways there are not cyborgs, it's feminism, which is a sociocultural point of view, like political relationships between the genders, popular culture, hardcore culture, and the post-human body. So you could say it even has a little neuroscience in it, but it's much more sociocultural and cognitive, not very much computation there. Addiction by Design, a terrific book. Everybody almost got that right, and some people didn't. That's also fine. The reason I put those 2 exclamations there is because it's also the only book here which is actually a design book. It's written by a designer, design researcher who takes us into the design of these systems in the book, and she's an ethnographer, so she looks at it from a design perspective. So that's like an outstanding book. And don't worry, I'll be revisiting all of these books at different points in the course and recommend you when I tell you that this is a recommended book, you should get it, then I will definitely let you know. But at the moment, these are just a collection of good books. And then Art of Thinking Clearly is actually a behavioral economics book. It's probably the most accessible behavioral economics book, and I have recommended it further in this class. So that was the exercise. Any thoughts on that before I jump into the next one? Katie is here, welcome.
Hello.
Yeah, I felt it was a little difficult to actually verify the answers. I just like looked at Amazon summaries, and which were kind of like, you know, vague as well. So all in all, it was kind of just like guessing the covers based on covers and then guessing on the back cover, basically.
Exactly. Yes.
Ashwin, if you had to choose one book to recommend from all of them, which one would it be?
It will be based on the topic. So today I'm recommending The Art of Thinking Clearly to you. But when it comes to the gamification class, I will recommend Addiction by Design. And I will recommend some more of these books depending on the topic. So don't worry about it. They're all contextual, basically. Thinking in Bets, Behavioral Economics, definitely I will be recommending that, but that we go into in choice and decision making next class. Excellent.
What I learned is to be careful if you're judging a book by its cover.
Indeed. Guys, this is horrible, but now Slack is saying this meeting will end in 10 minutes. Upgrade now to remove the 40-minute. Like, what is it doing? Why? How can I used this the last time.
Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
Did you log into your paid Zoom account for this?
Yes.
Yeah, because then it shouldn't have any limit.
I do not know what's happening. Zoom.us. And I am logged in. Sorry guys, this is my bad. I should have figured this out. My account, Ashwin Rajan.
If you don't want to lose time,
I'm logged in.
Yeah.
Sorry?
I'm just thinking one of us could open the room elsewhere and invite everybody there.
Please do, because I can of course upgrade right now. Let me go here, package options, register. Let me do this. Terribly sorry guys. How's your day going? Anybody want to grab a coffee or something? Okay. Choose your plan.
Wine coffees that Tom and Ines were having.
Cycle 30. Okay, this is where I didn't upgrade because I wanted to ask one of you. You can still see my screen, okay? Choose your subscription cycle. Ta-da. Now 13 month. And then do I choose cloud recording, or does that cloud recording for 2 hours come with this monthly plan?
It will record on your computer at the moment, so not cloud.
Okay.
That's the only difference. Yeah, so when you choose cloud, you can then choose if you want to save it to cloud or computer.
Sure, but if I add cloud, do I have to pay more than the $13.99?
Why don't you try? I think it will show you.
Guesses. Because every option adds more.
Right.
Right. 3 terabytes by up to 3 TB. Yep. Yeah, exactly. No, I don't need that. I'll just use this and I'm happy.
You can record it locally.
Yeah. Sounds good. I'll have to cancel because this thing did that. One more time. Pro 13. Save and continue. Bundle, add Zoom United. Interesting screenshot. No thanks. Zoom meetings,
Okay.
yes.
What lens was that? What kind of behavior trigger was that?
Yeah.
It's okay. Total. Now I have to give them my whole life story, my VAT number. How on earth would I have my VAT number on hand? Do I have it here? So
then we'll just keep staring when you put your card info right in front
I'm
of
waiting
our
for
eyes.
that step.
Screenshot it.
right now, I tell you, there isn't much in there except your money. No, it's yeah. No, actually, I'm just gonna use PayPal. Very comfy giving these guys my card. Yeah, I'm actually I'm actually adding an interesting thing on pricing. So a module on pricing for you guys later, and this means that what is it? 2499583. Yeah. And something. Verification failed. Fuck you. Didn't checkbox certify. Yeah. Done. 3099 blee place order. Yeah, so I'm going to add a pricing module to the course. I'm teaching it during one of the classes, and the price of the course is going up. So I hope you guys spread it to all your friends, and then I can make some money, and then I can give you my account. That's unbelievable. Oh, I was just logged into PayPal. It's asking me to log in again. I just made a purchase. This is called task analysis. Best way to improve UX. Yes, we're in business. Sorry, guys. Good, I got this done.
Nice.
Now, can we just do this? Okay, I am recording. Very good. Excellent. Super duper. Yeah, the second was this. Now, this was quite a huge case, and I'm actually, second homework was this, and I wanted to use this as a segue into this whole replication crisis problem, which I wanted to talk about really early and cover with you guys and not leave it until later. And this case, something called the implicit association test. It says that, you know, we make implicit associations about things, or we have implicit opinions about things like race or all kinds of stuff, including race, height, gender, and so on. And this test is kind of, it's weird because it's still being used as the standard test developed by people at Harvard and so on, to find out if you have implicit racial biases or gender biases and so on. And at the same time, there's more and more criticism that it actually does not work. So this is kind of like a deep problem in the behavioral and social sciences. This is a replication problem, or just a sort of lack of reliability. Something you need to be aware of is that as you work in this field more and more, you can expect to run into people who will just question your entire methodology or your entire approach where you're coming from, or even the scholars that you use. So imagine if you throw some theories out there and say, well, I'm talking about this neuroscience theory, this cognitive theory by these guys. They can say, well, do you know that it's been disproved, or those results have never been replicated? So that's just something as a practitioner to be aware of, which if you're not in academia, you don't really get a glimpse of. So in order to kind of, this is a very long article. I must confess, I didn't read the last 1/3 myself because it was so long and it was getting into these kind of prescriptive areas of, what to do, what not to do, and so on. But I think it's a really good read. And it was kind of like a very well-written or well kind of argued article. So I sent it out to you, but do read it when you have the time. But it gives you a good idea of like what this problem is. But today I want to go deeper into the problem itself using this video. So I'll have to stop my share. I'll have to reshare. Okay, let's see if you can hear this.
Baumeister decided to investigate a question that psychologists had been thinking about for a while. Do people have a In 1998, a scientist named Roy Baumeister decided to investigate a question that psychologists had been thinking about for a while.
By the way, this is about an 8-minute video, so I'm going to show you the whole thing. I think it's important, so just chillax and lean back.
Do people have a limited amount of willpower? To figure it out, he and his research group did what researchers do. They conducted a study. The results of that study seem to show that humans do have a limited pool of self-control. In other words, once we've had to resist temptation, it's a lot harder to do it again. They called this effect ego depletion, and the idea has had a huge influence on psychological research ever since. It's been incorporated into things like dieting tactics, athletic training techniques, and advertising. But now, it seems like the phenomenon might not exist at all, which has a lot of scientists worried about the way we do psychology research in general. The concept of the ego goes way back. Sigmund Freud, who's often called the father of modern psychology, described the ego as the aspect of our personality that makes decisions about how to interact with the real world. The ego has to figure out how to balance our needs and desires within the context of reality and society. Freud believed that the ego would need energy to keep up with those demands and decisions, but that was about as far as he got. Baumeister and his colleagues were trying to test the 1990s version of this idea, that self-control is a limited resource and it takes energy and motivation to maintain restraint. According to this ego depletion theory, every time you use your self-control, you draw on that strength, and it takes some time for you to recover it. So to test this hypothesis, Baumeister's team decided to create a task that would require 2 acts of self-control back to back. They figured if self-control can be used up, then having to use a lot of self-control on the first task would mean that the subjects would have less self-control available for the second task. So first they baked a bunch of chocolate chip cookies in a little oven in the lab so the whole room smelled like fresh cookies. Then they invited 67 psych students into the lab, making sure they hadn't eaten anything for a while. When the students arrived, they were each brought into the baking room and asked to sit at a table. On the table were 2 plates, one filled with those fresh, delicious cookies, and the other filled with radishes. Some of the students were told that they had to eat the radishes but no cookies, while others were told that they were supposed to eat the cookies but no radishes. Then each student was left alone in the room for 5 minutes. When the experimenter came back, they asked the student to try to solve a difficult puzzle. But here's the thing. the puzzle was designed to be impossible to solve. What the researchers really wanted to know was how long it took for the students to give up, and if spending a few minutes resisting cookies would make it harder for them to keep trying. They found a big difference between the students who weren't allowed to eat cookies and the students who were. The students who were asked to only eat radishes before doing the puzzle gave up on it in about 8 minutes. But the students who were told to eat the cookies worked at the puzzle for more than twice as long, almost 19 minutes on average. When a third group of students did the puzzle without any cookie encounters at all, they spent just a little longer trying to solve it, averaging 21 minutes each. This seemed like very solid evidence for ego depletion. The researchers concluded that the students who were only allowed to eat radishes had to use a lot of self-control not to touch the delicious chocolatey cookies, so when they got to the puzzle test, they didn't have much willpower left to spare. But the students who got to eat the cookies didn't have to control themselves. They could just dig right in. Their willpower reserves were much higher, so they worked at the puzzle longer. The same group did several more experiments designed to test willpower under different circumstances and found the same results. Whenever participants were asked to do something that required self-control, they had a harder time with the puzzle task, which was a huge deal. A lot of the time, it can be difficult to draw broad conclusions from psychology studies. Often effects are only seen under very specific conditions, and if you change an experiment even a little, you might end up with very different findings. But Baumeister and his colleagues had shown that this effect applied to more than just cookies and radishes. Ego depletion showed up in all kinds of different experiments. And after that, ego depletion basically became its own subfield of psychology. In 2007, researchers at Florida State University figured out what seemed to be happening biologically as people used up their self-control. Their blood sugar levels were dropping. Our brains are high-energy organs. They need a lot of energy to keep going, and that energy comes from sugar. The team thought that the psychological effort of maintaining self-control might use up extra energy, which could mean that the brain was burning through its available reserves faster than normal. They tested this idea by having some subjects do willpower-related tasks, like watching an emotional or graphic video without showing any emotion, while other subjects didn't have to hold back. Sure enough, the people who'd used some willpower had lower blood glucose levels. And when they replenished that glucose with a nice refreshing glass of sugary lemonade, it seemed to restore their self-control. The evidence was pretty convincing, and became even more convincing in 2010 when yet another group of researchers did a meta-analysis. They examined the results from 83 different published studies on ego depletion and concluded that the effect was real. But recently, some studies have started to cast doubt on this whole ego depletion thing. One group of researchers, for example, found that subjects didn't actually have to drink lemonade to replenish their willpower. Just tasting it, without the corresponding changes in blood glucose, could be enough. Others found that what subjects believed about willpower could affect their performance on self-control tasks. Participants who believed ego depletion was real gave up on difficult tasks way before those who didn't. And people who thought of willpower as an infinite resource did just as well on the second difficult task as people who hadn't done the first task at all. Then in 2014, some scientists tried to replicate the original studies and couldn't find the effect. The group decided to look more closely at that 2010 meta-analysis, and they found a whole bunch of problems. For one thing, when they reanalyzed the data using newer methods, the ego depletion effect disappeared. For another, the data included in the analysis in the first place was probably biased in favor of ego depletion. See, scientific publications tend to publish positive results, the kind that prove the researcher's hypothesis. In other words, researchers might have done lots of studies that didn't find evidence of ego depletion, but odds are those results wouldn't have gotten published. The meta-analysis only looked at the data from published studies. There might have been plenty of studies that didn't find the ego depletion effect, but the analysis just wasn't taking those into account. When the team went back and included other unpublished data in the analysis, they found that, again, the ego depletion effect just wasn't there. These results were popping up right as a wave of concern about replicability was spreading through the psychology community. More and more researchers were saying they couldn't reproduce the results of various psychological studies. This wasn't just ego depletion, this was all of psychology, and people were starting to doubt whether they could really trust the published literature. All of this uncertainty led the Association for Psychological Science to open a registered replication report on ego depletion. Basically, one official experiment based on a study originally published in 2014 would be conducted by researchers in many different labs. Each group of scientists would analyze their results and compare them to the results of other research groups. Baumeister, the head of the original study, was brought in to help design the experiments, and the psychologist who led the 2010 meta-analysis, Martin Hager, agreed to lead the project. Subjects were told to watch words flash on a screen and to press a button whenever they saw a word containing the letter E, but not if the letter E was within 2 spaces of another vowel. If that sounds like the most tedious, annoying thing ever, that was the point. The subjects had to pay close attention, and just like the original study, they then had to perform a follow-up self-control task. But when Hager's team did the same experiment in 24 different labs in different countries and languages, the ego depletion effect evaporated. Only 2 of the 24 groups found the effect at all, and even one group found the opposite effect. So what does this all mean for ego depletion? It depends. You could argue that it's just this particular task with the words flashing on the screen where ego depletion doesn't show up, but that willpower is still a limited resource. The thing is, the main reason why the ego depletion effect was such a big deal was that it held true across so many different tests, from cookies and radishes to conversations about race and discrimination to making decisions about what cleaning product to buy. But now it seems like ego depletion only happens under very specific circumstances, if at all.
Yeah. So that was the point of that whole thing, just to show you that how a certain set of studies done at some time can trigger a whole bunch of other studies and books and research and so on, and lead to entire classes of theories or ideas which then can get disproven over time. In fact, even Daniel Kahneman himself has had critiques about the entire prospect theory and some of his key ideas, which he has agreed that it hasn't always been replicable. So it's one of those things that you guys should just kind of keep in mind, and it's something I want to go into a little bit more with this specific book here, Triggers. Any thoughts on this before I go forward? Anyone shocked and wants to leave the field right now?
I'm just thinking like how awesome and how inspiring those studies are. It's like you can educate yourself to just taste the lemonade instead of drinking it, and get healthier and just not eat junk while also staying productive. So like there is some little tricks that you can learn for yourself, which is fun. But the more you listen to it, the more there is no single answer to anything basically, and that's frustrating.
Exactly, and that's why I think understanding what I'm saying is the difference between theory, hypotheses, experimentation, evidence, like understanding the scientific method at a very simple level and being able to trace back how all this knowledge just kind of gets generated and how you can use it. It's very, very important. So for example, this book, let's go really slowly here. This book, like I said, has a interesting title. And I thought, wow, specifically a book on triggers, that's great, because triggers is one of those subjects where you don't have entire books written on them so much. They are kind of smaller. There's sub-subjects inside books on habit and so on, or just behavior change. And the whole book on triggers looked very interesting, so I decided to get it and I looked into it. And of course, there were some nuggets and some interesting pieces, but I couldn't really tell, like, what was this guy's world? Like, where was he coming from? What was his foundation? And then I started to investigate more of Marshall Goldsmith's work, and I came upon, for example, this video. You guys able to hear me clearly?
Yeah, perfect.
Yeah.
Yeah, all good.
Okay, just one thing. Is it just me, or is there like this scratching, knocking sounds? Can you guys hear it?
Yeah, there is some.
Yeah.
Can you? It's a little bit distracting. It's like this ASMR sound. I was like, I went through my tabs to see if I didn't open something by mistake, but
could it be one of you guys?
Yeah, like this one.
Mute.
Like this one.
Oh yeah, I hear it now, but it's not coming from my end, guys.
Okay.
At least. Unless
I'll just continue.
All right. If it's too, yeah. Anyway, so let's listen to this. Let's listen to Marshall Goldsmith and his video on adding too much value. I promise from now on, all the videos are much shorter, so chillax.
A classic challenge for smart, successful leaders is adding too much value. Adding too much value. Now, what does that mean? I am young, smart, enthusiastic. You're my manager. I come to you with an idea. You think it's a great idea. Rather than just saying great idea, our natural tendency is to say, that is a nice idea. Why don't you add this to it? The problem is the quality of the idea may go up 5%. My commitment to execute the idea may go down 50%. It's no longer my idea, boss. Now it's your idea. Effectiveness of execution is a function of A, what is the quality of the idea, times B, what is my commitment to make it work? I learned that from my great friend, David Ulrich. Well, we can get so wrapped up trying to improve the quality this much, we damage the commitment that much. One of my great coaching clients retired a few years ago. His name, J.P. Garnier. J.P. was the CEO of a very large drug company called GlaxoSmithKline. I asked JP, what did you learn about leadership as the CEO of GlaxoSmithKline? He said, I've learned a very hard lesson. And every time you become more powerful in life, every time you get promoted, this lesson will become more real for you. He said, my suggestions become orders. My suggestions become orders. Now, he said, if there's...
Right, so you guys get the drift, right? So it's these kinds of really very flimsy statements of adding too much value. My friend is this big dude. This other great guy said something to me. It's all anecdotal. It's all claims. My suggestions become orders. What the? I mean, I have to use the F word there. What is he talking about, right? There's a lot of this kind of stuff, and they're increasingly indiscernible from the good stuff. And that's kind of a real danger, because a lot of people, for example, younger UX designers who are increasingly calling themselves behavioral designers, user researchers, they don't really read the real stuff. And when there's a serious replication crisis going on at the core of the industry, at the core of academia, you can imagine how flimsy all this other fringe stuff can be. And so I thought it's really important to kind of keep this problem very central in mind, and just kind of unpack this a little bit. A couple of things that are going on here. This guy is using a very strong, what can be called an authority bias, right? And it basically says that it's our tendency to attribute greater accuracy to the opinion of an authority figure and to be more influenced. So it's written all over his presentation. It's like, my friend, this author, my friend, that CEO, I'm part of this Thinkers 50. And if you go into his website and look at his stuff, it's all there's all these badges and labels and stuff. And that's the real message. He doesn't have real content there to communicate, but he's using, and of course, if you sit in, I mean, at his age, you can read, you've been reading your whole life, you can pick out words from all of these cool words like triggers and behavior change and this and that and whatnot, and bias and so on, and decision-making and choice and whatnot. You can all mash it together and come up with these interesting rules like, oh, don't preach what you can't do, or, you know, like whatever he was saying. So just to say, this is a bias that's, and it's nice that the first bias we're addressing starts with an A in our entire course. There's also something called the automation bias. The automation bias is the propensity for humans to favor suggestions from automated decision-making systems, our implicit trust on technology. Oh, I typed in triggers and YouTube showed me this guy's videos at one of the top 10, so he must be good, right? But not necessarily. And that source, essentially we have incomplete information in that situation, and we are going we're making a decision about watching this guy based on an automated system. So, and then we tend to ignore contradictory information. So a couple of biases that are at work here. So I wanted to go from there into this whole experimentation thing before getting into nudging itself. And like I said in the first class, it'd be nice to have, we're trying to have a parallel research and experimentation process thinking throughout the course, and maybe turn that into some real work as well as we go deeper. But I think the fundamentals, which I think a lot of thinkers get, or people, practitioners get confused about, is that they don't see this very simple three-part process. I couldn't make it simpler than this. So typically, we want to go with an experimentation approach always, right? Because theory is theory, and it needs to be replicated. And when you run the same intervention with another group or a slightly different group, the results can be different, right? Human behavior is very, very complex and changing. So we want to go with an experimental approach so we can actually get closer to real behavior change. And there's three I wouldn't say parts, but it's kind of like three keys to experimentation, or three blocks. The first is to understand that there's something called theory. And theory is, a set of ideas or principles. You're just trying to explain something. You have a point of view, you have a perspective, which is very different from a hypothesis. A lot of the times people confuse hypotheses and theory. When they say, what is your hypothesis? They're actually stating a theory, not stating a hypothesis. The theory is the big picture, the big world. I'll give you some examples. Hypothesis is actually a single causal proposition. It proposes why some behavior is caused by something, what causes some behavior. And hypotheses can always be tested. Theory cannot be tested, right? So if I say all humans are kind, that's a theory. It's impossible to test that theory because it's not yet a hypothesis. It's a claim, right? But then I'll have to turn that theory into a hypothesis and say, John is a human, John is always kind, right? And then you're going to say, but I can't test if John is always kind because John could live 100 years. How am I going to test every action of his? So then I'm going to have to narrow it down and say, John is kind when he is around shopping malls. Okay. So then is that still a good representation of the theory? Maybe not. So you see what happens? You need to think between theories and hypotheses this way. And then finally, if you do have a hypothesis that can be tested, that can be experimented with, you can run an experimentation, you can come up with what are called findings. And findings are the results from experiments which prove your hypotheses, which then lend some credibility to the theory, right? So let's look at another example. We saw Marshall Goldsmith doing his la la la. Let's look at how Richard Dawkins speaks about the selfish gene and analyze it based on this model that we just developed. Again, just a few minutes video. Sorry, so loud.
The gene is immortal. In fact, a publisher once, when I showed him the first couple of chapters of The Selfish Gene, said you shouldn't call it that, you should call it the immortal gene. And perhaps I should have done. Genes are immortal in the sense that the coded information they contain is reproduced, is replicated with almost total fidelity, significantly, not absolutely total fidelity, generation after generation after generation, such that there are genes which are identical to what they were tens of millions of years ago, hundreds of millions of years ago in a few cases. So genes are immortal, not the DNA, of course that's not, that turns over in a very short space of time, but the coded information is potentially immortal. And that means that the difference between a successful gene and an unsuccessful gene really matters. It's going to matter for millions of years.
Excellent. So if you can see what he's doing here, very different from the claims and the approach of Marshall Goldsmith from earlier, right? In just one sentence, Dawkins, in that previous video, he went about what he did in this very scientific way. He proposed a theory which gave you a view of the world. Genes are immortal, impossible to test, right? That's a claim. But then he boiled it down immediately into a hypothesis, a testable proposition which has causality, in the sense that the coded information they contain is replicated with almost total fidelity. That's something you can test. You can test if a gene's coded information is replicated or not. Maybe not over millions of years, maybe they figured out some way to do that, but you can definitely test it over a certain period of time. And then he gave a very specific finding. He didn't just end with the hypotheses. He said, look, there is evidence. Then he says there are genes. He's talking about stuff that's there, apparently. There are genes that are identical to what they were tens of millions of years ago. So what seems like common language, if you know how someone's thinking, you can make out the difference between bullshit and real shit, right? Or the shit. So I just thought that was a pretty good example to think about. So don't confuse theory with hypothesis. We use this word a lot. In fact, I was talking to a friend of mine who works at the most well-paid consulting company in the world. And I said, hypotheses is causal about behavior. And he was like mocking me and saying, we use the word hypotheses like 20 times a day. At office, we say, what's your hypothesis for lunch? What's your hypothesis for, this client? And it's like, no, what's your theory? We're not talking about hypotheses. We're just talking about a general, what's your view kind of thing. A hypothesis is a causal proposition. Something causes something. And in our case, we're interested in causes of behavior. We're interested in propositions that specify behavioral change or behavioral stuff happening. And we are trying to write them out in a way that can be tested. So do not confuse theory with hypotheses. Again, it's something that you can get used to. So this is an example here. We can chat about this after I finish this section. But theory, the airport is busier than usual today. So let's say we headed to the airport. That would be nice, right, Ines? I know, heading to the airport, almost like unheard of. Airport is busier than usual today. It's just my claim, but then there's no way I can test that. So I need to turn that theory into hypotheses. And so I say, if it takes us more than 35 minutes to get the boarding pass, then yes, it is busier than usual today. That hypothesis can actually be turned into an experiment, which I can go there, we can go there, it takes us 35 minutes or more to get the boarding pass. And we're gonna say, yep, I think that theory was right? So that's basically behavioral science thinking. And what happens at the big picture level is that you basically have a theory which generates hypotheses, which then generate experiments, which create findings. This evidence creates what's called first principles. The first principles thinking is becoming super common in the startup and the business world. And what it's really about is kind of saying, starting from what we know is absolutely true. It's not starting anecdotally. So what Marshall Goldsmith was doing was all anecdotal. My friend in this project, I always say, I was given this award because you don't know if it's true. There's no way to validate that. So getting hard evidence or finding the evidence that someone else created through their own experiment gives us those first principles from which we can base new theories and then design new hypotheses for behavioral experimentation. Now, just before we go to questions, I want to quickly show you a short piece on Steven Pinker. Well, if you guys have questions now, we can go into it, but this is just to show you how another example of this thinking. Hello?
Yes.
Oh, great. Sorry. All right. Everyone's here. Funnily, when I say Zoom, I can't see you guys. Anyways, so I guess no questions, so I'll just jump into this Steven Pinker thing.
I don't believe there's such a thing as free will in the sense of a ghost in the machine, a spirit or soul that somehow reads the TV screen of the senses and pushes buttons and pulls levers of behavior. There's no sense that we can make of that. I think our behavior is the product of physical processes in the brain. On the other hand, when you have a brain that consists of 100 billion neurons connected by 100 trillion synapses, there is a vast amount of complexity that means that human choices will not be predictable in any simple way from the stimuli that have impinged on it beforehand. We also know that that brain is set up so that there are at least two kinds of behavior. There's what happens when I shine a light in your eye and your iris contracts, or I hit your knee with a hammer and your leg jerks upward. We also know that there's a part of the brain that does things like choose what to have for dinner, whether to order chocolate or vanilla ice cream, how to move the next chess piece, whether to pick up the paper or put it down. That is very different from your iris closing when I shine a light in your eye. That second kind of behavior, one that engages vast amounts of the brain, particularly the frontal lobes, that incorporates an enormous amount of information in the causation of the behavior, that has some mental model of the world that can predict the consequences of possible behavior and select them on the basis of those consequences. All of those things carve out the realm of behavior that we call free will, which it is useful to distinguish from brute involuntary reflexes, but which doesn't necessarily have to involve some mysterious soul.
I like that clip because it's so brilliant how simple but very deep his analysis goes. He's taking a really complex thing like free will and he's turning it into a conversation, but at the same time, he's giving you very strong theory. I don't believe this kind of free will exists in the sense of he made it very clear as to what he means by free will, so he doesn't just leave it to your imagination. Then he gave you lots of evidence and said, we know this, we know that, we found this, we found that. And somewhere between those two, he also did a little hypothesizing where he kind of said, this is something we tested or this is something we tried to figure out and we got evidence for that. And therefore, he concluded, he came back and closed his argument saying, therefore, this is my theory. This is my view of the system. So that's a really solid thinker. Whether he's right or wrong, that's a process for thinking, which then can also help you design strong experiments and be much more in the right side of the science than on the wrong side. So yeah, any questions before I jump into nudging itself? I just wanted to touch this experimentation part today. Or thoughts or comments or anything?
I can jump in. So I think, and maybe this is like too deep at this point, but
no worries.
Like I guess like the reason like science is so amazing is that we can have findings and then continue to build on top of them. So like at what point do we build versus going back to like as far back as we can for first principles, I guess?
No, first principles, I would say is, that's a great question. First of all, I would say the first principles are something that, that we can take for certain. So what do we know is true? So if you are developing a product for people with ADHD, you want to help them solve their going to sleep on time problem, you don't actually have many first principles. You do have some research on sleep, you have maybe a lot of research on ADHD and so on. But in that context, you're going to have to find some first principles of your own, which means getting to implementation or experimentation as soon as possible is the best way to go. And that's what we're here for. But what can be done is what sources to look for. So the better, the more reliable, the more robust the sources that we build on using this method and looking at all of these experts out there critically, the better we get at that, the better chances we have to do some effective or more effective interventions. Great.
Building on top of that,
yes.
Like on this question of building on top of kind of previous research and findings.
Yes.
Taking this example of ego depletion, what does that mean now for, say, decision fatigue? Like is and other things that are sort of related in the related area. You know,
That's
that,
right. Yeah, great. It's a great question. I mean, I can see this is a kind of a punch in the stomach, isn't it? But this is a reality of the field that we need to be aware of, because see the video on ego depletion, the reason I showed you the whole thing was because just to show you that actually he didn't end with a very strong conclusion. He ended with "it depends." So depending on how you see it, depending on which studies, which researchers you want to believe, yes, it exists. And then if you look at it in another way, it doesn't. So yeah, there are those things that are just fuzzy. And I'll go into more behavioral economics today, and everything is up in the air. Everything is up for grabs. So the way I would look at it is, take that idea, test it, and if it works for you in your setting, or seems to work for you in your setting, in your project, you've got something to go on. But never accept anything as gospel when it comes to human beings.
This is true.
Awesome. Great questions, guys. I'm going to jump into history of nudging a little, and this is juicy stuff. So get your caffeine, and this is great stuff, fun stuff. So we looked at this thing here, and we said, I have a ugly floating panel. We looked at behavioral economics, and we said, this is the lens. Indeed, it is. You guys got familiar with a number of things related to behavioral economics. Here, which is these words, nudge, it comes from their decision making. They think about it a lot, think about things like choice. They're also a very experimental profession. That's very nice. That's why we love behavioral economics, and we love to use their methods. And we also use their methods understanding their limits. They also gave us biases. Wow, but so did cognitive science. Anyways, we are in this world today. Pretty much all that we do in behavioral science today is traced back to this idea of bounded rationality, before the idea of irrationality, which is more common today with books like Predictably Irrational, or the fact that we are irrational decision makers, was the original idea of bounded rationality. Herbert Simon was an economist and a psychologist, and he came up with this idea, which essentially was the key to the whole field as we know it. And this was, I think, in the 50s or something. So he said it's a human decision-making process in which we attempt to satisfy rather than optimize. So basically he said we seek a decision that will be good enough rather than the best possible decision, which was a huge blow to classical economics view, which said that human beings are rational, and because they are rational, they look at all the different options, like with this very in-depth analysis, and then they choose what's best for them. They optimize. So obviously you do what's best for you, right? I mean, if you're given 5 options between what to eat and what bank to bank with, or which clothes to wear today, you optimize, you go for the best possible decision. But actually, no, because we have incomplete information, and we have all sorts of other constraints, all sorts of other influences, social, emotional, etc. We actually do something called satisficing. And people who study design will immediately realize that satisficing is something you learn in design theory. It's brilliant. There's this overlap between behavioral economics world and the design world at more than almost a century ago already. So how do you decide? This is an example that's kind of quite commonly known to all you guys. You go there, you have all these products, they're all screaming for your attention. You have to make your decision based on some cue that's incomplete. This is a classic case of satisficing, where you look at the label, you kind of look at some grading, maybe if you're aware of them. Some people want something that's like free roaming or organic or something else, and other people care about nutritional value. But no matter what, If a box said free roaming or it said organic, there's no way for you to stand in the supermarket and actually do the research and find out if that egg was truly organic or if it was sustainable, right? So we have to work with incomplete cues. We have to work with limited information. And therefore, we can't optimize, because if you are an optimal human being, you would actually do the research and get the product that was actually organic. That's what optimizing means. But actually, you just satisfies. You make do with what's good enough. And that's why I was seeing this documentary called Seaspiracy. I really recommend it. It's just scary. This last week, and I sent it to some guys here as well. It talks all about just the state of the global fishing industry and like how pathetic it is, like just how many horrible things go on. One of them being the use of this label. I think this was in the US, not sure, or is it even in Europe? I'm not sure. But this label is so-called Certified Sustainable Seafood. Not only is that organization like deeply funded by corporate interests, but they also have no real clarity on what is sustainable. This guy goes and tries to interview people in the organization. They can't explain what's sustainable. They definitely cannot trace what's sustainable. They basically give you that label if you pay them money. You can go with your ship into the sea, get some whatever seafood back and buy that label and stick it on there. And the so-called association has no way of even knowing what you've done out there. Is it sustainable? How many other creatures you've killed and whatnot, what your practices are. But what that label helps is it helps us satisfy. It helps us quickly kind of make up our minds and say, I'm looking for tuna today, but oh wow, sustainable tuna, let's grab it, right? So this satisficing is something that we do, and it's also something that's exploited a lot. This is of course a negative example. This came to us from a behavioral economics thinker. And if you look at this book, which is one of my recommendations for today, if you don't have it, I recommend you get it. It's been a companion for me through the years. It puts this, it covers satisficing in really nice level of detail and gives some examples. It's a design book. Basically says, often preferable to settle for a satisfactory solution rather than pursue an optimal one. So the difference there is you already have this satisfactory solution in front of you. Why would you invest more time and money? Why would you spend more, make more of an effort to go after that optimal solution? We usually do not do that. We satisfy. So this is a key idea given by Herbert Simon already, way before Nudge, 50, 60, 70 years before Nudge. And so I had a couple of questions, or just wanted to reflect for a second and thought of like the airport again, because it's this interesting context where decision-making is kind of challenged a lot, I think. Can you think of any moments at the airport that you satisfied or instances? Ines is a little bit like the airport resident master here. She's always, whenever I text her and say, hey, what's up? She's in an airport. It used to happen to us for years. Do you remember any satisfying?
Such a satisfactory experience most of the time when I'm at the airport. It's like
yeah,
all the, you know, the security checks and all that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm. So yeah, that's exactly the point, right? I mean, I'm not talking about your satisfaction. I'm talking about your tendency to just make do with something, right? To just do with something that's good enough.
Probably like grabbing a sandwich from a nearby cart instead
Yes.
of going to find a nice, like healthier option.
Exactly. Yes. Great point. Any more?
The crappy internet connection.
Mm-hmm. Exactly.
Yeah, I was about to say that, yeah.
Excellent. You just make do, right?
Internet.
What can you do?
It's like choosing a queue as
Or
well.
choosing,
Yeah. Go ahead, Philip.
or choosing an underpowered socket only to get the few percentage more on your phone or on your computer.
Exactly. Great examples. Any more? Yeah, I think airports, they're built on this design principle or this human behavioral principle, because what can you do? You have to catch a plane, you have limited resources, you have limited time in terms of time, basically, and space, and it's linear, so you can't go too far and come back. You got to stick to where your bay is, etc., etc. So pretty much anything. You might do spontaneous shopping there, thinking, oh, this jacket's for discount. Damn, let me just get it, because will I get a chance to get it 50% off? It's not the greatest, but let me do it. I can just sit here. It's not the most comfortable seat, but it's just a few minutes. Or food being the big one, food and all kinds of stuff you put in your body. But it turns out that satisficing typically it kind of shows up when there are these three characteristics. When problems are complex, we tend to satisfy. That is, when there's limited amount of information or just the complexity of the problem is too much. Like, yeah, I could go and look at every store in the airport and find a pair of shoes that's better, but I don't have the time and I don't know where the stores are, so I'll just buy this shoe for 50%, right? Complexity of problems. Also time-bound problems. We tend to satisfy when we are limited, when time is limited. The third one is very interesting, and it kind of leads into where satisficing and bounded rationality goes, the history of bounded rationality goes. We tend to satisfy beyond, for problems where anything beyond satisfactory solution does not give any added returns. So the returns are diminishing. So yeah, there's this greasy pizza, or kind of just like a basic pizza, and I could go and find something better, but it might only be 20% better or 10% better. Is it worth all that trouble? So I'm going to satisfy, right? So these are three key characteristics why people satisfy. And it happens in a lot of contexts, not just airports. So recommended reading, definitely. I'll drop these in the books channel of Slack. What happened is, so this idea that our rationality is bounded, we are rational. When you say someone's rational, you're supposed to be like reasonable and do all the homework and optimize, but no, we don't. We go with, just good enough stuff was the genius of what Simon came up with. He called it bounded rationality. And many years later, Daniel Kahneman, the famous Daniel Kahneman, who's very central to behavioral economics, the key figure really, pretty much created it without knowing it, came with something called prospect theory. So as you can see, we are in the land of theories, just as we spoke about earlier. You have theory, you have hypothesis, from there you have evidence through experimentation. That's how it goes. These guys are all big theorists. Of course, they did a lot of experiments, and then they kind of created these theories, which is a set of principles from the evidence. Came up with something called prospect theory. Now, I know these words are daunting, but really, believe me, this is the difference between knowing your subject and between just watching some YouTube videos and about biases and then making a LinkedIn post on it. And honestly, these are not that hard. So I really recommend you guys take the time to get into this. And once you understand it, it's so much fun. There's a lot to explore. So I'll go into prospect theory a little bit today, which is pretty much the thick part of today's presentation. Of course, this is a book which you just have to get. Highly, highly recommend it. I've heard behavioral design experts saying that they have never finished this book, kind of complaining how heavy it is and so on. But I don't think so. It's actually a beautifully written book. It's very nicely, anecdotally written stories, but it is dense. But you don't try to read the whole thing at once or over a summer. You just have the book on your shelf, and over 2-3 years, you go back to it slowly. And over about 3 to 5 years, you start to get an understanding of, aha, this is what he's trying to get at. But it's good to read it from the source. Then all these abridged sources and all the websites on behavioral economics who are just taking that and trying to simplify it for you, they leave out some of the real juice. So I recommend go to the source, get the book, and just read it slowly over years and pick out what you understand, you'll get it. But today we'll go to the core of that with prospect theory. Why understand prospect theory? It's like I said, a lot of people say, why this is too weird, it's too dense. I'm a designer, I don't need to understand it. I'm arguing the opposite. I'm like, that's exactly what you need to understand the source, So it will differentiate you in the market. And when you go out there, you're sitting in a meeting room with a bunch of people who talk behavioral design, behavior change, ask them behavioral economics, have you looked into prospect theory? And look at their faces change. 90% would never have heard of it because they're just looking at nudges and biases. They live in that world. And no one goes to the theoretical level, not many. And the ones who do, they are your friends. Then you have some real mental, stuff to go on. So I really recommend understanding it, and we'll get into it today. So it's a bold task, but we'll get into it. I got this lovely graphic through that Medium link through some guy. I will share that article. It's a really nice article on prospect theory. But one way to understand prospect theory is to take this picture, which Daniel Kahneman called, he said if prospect theory had a flag, or behavioral economics had a flag, this would be it. And this is that one picture which just communicates this really complex theory, which created an entire field and created all of these biases and all this stuff that we know. This one picture, so simple. Now you see what's happening is you have two axes here. One is your horizontal axis. You have a dollar amount. So the value here is literal value. It's something you can count, quantitative value. Then you have this really interesting other y-axis, the vertical axis, which is psychological value, something qualitative, something humans can experience, but you cannot really count it. Those are the two key axes. You have two plotted numbers, 100 and 200, on both scales, on both sides. And then you have this interesting curve. Now, when you look at this curve, this is where things get really interesting. You see that the curve on the positive right-hand side, the green side, the slope of the curve is actually climbs, and then it kind of starts to peter off. It starts to flatline, right? And it flatlines and it climbs slower than it falls. Whereas the depth of the curve on the other side, the falling curve in the red side, is much deeper, way deeper. It's almost twice as deep. So basically what this thing is trying to say, this graph, is that for a certain loss or gain in quantitative value, the experience of that value is very different. So 100 euros lost versus 100 euros gained is not perceived, it's not felt the same way. In fact, it's felt about twice as intensely. That core idea is the whole of prospect theory. And from there, you just have all these interesting ideas emerging. Does that make sense so far? Okay, I'll get into some of those characteristics. Again, $100, $200 gained, $100, $200 lost. The amount of money gained and the amount of money lost is exactly the same. But the psychological value, the feelings associated to it, the experience of it, the subjective, the cognitive side, if you will, it's very different. Now, what does that give us? It gives us three key characteristics. One is, when it comes to this thing called psychological value, how I value something, how I value a relationship, so a bike has 200, a bike may cost me 500 euros. That's its fixed price. It's its qualitative value. Whether I go to the store, you go to the store, we both get the bike for 200 euros. But the psychological value that I place on that bike, the psychological value that Philippe places on that bike will be very different. We differ there because it's a very subjective, qualitative thing. That value, we perceive it from a random reference point. There's always a reference point. We tend to think of that from a reference point. And that reference point is random. I'll get into that a little bit. The second key thing is, as you can see, the slope on the positive side is not as intense, it's not as sharp as the slope on the negative side. We are less sensitive to increasing gains. So 100 to 200, 0 to 100, we feel certain amount of happiness. 100 to 200, we feel a little more happiness, but not the same as 0 to 100. By the time you go to 1 million, that's why the happiness of having 100 and receiving another 100 on top of it seems like a lot more than having 1 million and receiving 100 on top of it. It's like, why does that million plus 100 not feel so equally intense? It's exactly 1 more 100 euros gained. You've not gained any less or more money in both cases. But that's the thing, our perception of value reduces, we become less sensitive to increasing gains. Now the exact opposite happens on the other side. We are more sensitive to increasing losses. Now imagine the opposite case. If you only had 200 and you lost 100, you'd be, feeling like, well, that's shitty, that really sucks, but I lost 100, fine. Imagine if you had 100 and you lost 1 million. You had 200 and you lost 1 million. Then you're going to feel really, really bad. Or in general, losing hurts. And the more you lose, the more it hurts. We don't need to get into the exact mathematics of it, but you generally get the idea. And these key things, reference point, a random reference point, sensitivity to increase, less sensitivity to increasing gains and more sensitivity to increasing losses, that's the whole thing, is the core of prospect theory. Now you can start seeing how these principles or how these characteristics, how they kind of manifest. When you start perceiving value from a random reference point, you have what's called an anchoring bias. An anchoring bias is like a very common, one of the key biases. Again, there are lots and lots of biases. Like I keep reading about new biases all the time. So there's no way in the next year or next 2-3 years you're going to be a master at all of them. But again, this is the stuff that is a good start, and when you know the basis for it, you can start adding to a repertoire and slowly build them up. Anchoring bias is one of the key biases. Basically, it's a bias that says we rely too heavily on the first piece of information we are given. What does that look like? It's a good example. You see the first mug, $300. You see the second mug, it's exactly the same mug, it's $1,000, and you're getting it for 300, and you feel like, wow, that's such a bargain. Because of that first mug, you have anchored a certain value to that mug. If that first mug wasn't there, you wouldn't have that reference point. And if you just saw the second mug and you said 1,300, well, it looks like a bargain, but you wouldn't have an anchor. So persuasion and behavior works strongly when it comes to when there's anchoring. Any thoughts so far? I think more than the specifics of this, it's the thinking process and kind of like the connection that I'm trying to draw. But yeah, please go ahead.
I'm just tuning in. I think it's really interesting, and it's really good to get some also background knowledge about the prospect theory.
Great.
That I haven't heard much about before.
Yeah. Great. That's great to know.
Yeah, I also hadn't heard about, is this like this, I've heard about like loss aversion. Is that like?
Yes, we will come to, yes, a lot. See, that's the thing. You have prospect theory, which is this general theory. The theory has, if you read the book, it has maybe 8 or 10 key principles. I'm talking about the top 3 principles. Okay, the theory has 3 sub-theories, you could say, right? Which is this, and this. Each of these sub-theories give you biases and effects like loss aversion, like endowment effect, like yada, 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 yada. Those hundreds of effects, they come out of the interaction of these. So the first one we saw was this, the anchoring effect. I'll quickly jump to the last one and come back. Loss aversion comes out of this. We are more sensitive to increasing losses. That creates loss aversion. When the pain of losing is twice as much as the pain of winning. You see? So that's how that works. great question. I'll go back to my flow so I don't break my flow. The other key thing is this random reference point. As we saw, this first mug is a reference point. So you got, it kind of hooked you into something. And then from there, you began to look at other things. Yeah, a common thing I try to take is reference point is also the a menu. Menus use this very well, restaurant menus. You go in there, like the buffet of the day is something, or there's this soup of the day, or there is this item, this combo, something will always stand out. So your value, your perceived value is you have a reference point. And then usually people don't go for the reference point, they go for something cheaper. So you say, the average price of a meal here is about 15. Well, some days you're flush and you're like, yeah, let's just get that or get something even better. But mostly then you have an anchor and then you weigh the place against that anchor and you say, well, yeah, this looks like a 15 euro place. That's fine. I'll spend 12 or whatever. The other thing that happens with this reference points is you're able to frame something called a framing effect. It's when our decisions are influenced by the way information is presented. So this is a good example of that. You have a surgery consent form. On both sides, the same form. On the left, the form says the surgery has a 90% chance of success. On the right side, it says it has a 10% risk of complications, right? If you look at it, the risk is the actual risk, the quantitative risk is exactly the same. It's just framed differently. One is framed positively and the other is framed negatively, but we have a very different reaction to those. 10% risk of complications? Shit, that sounds like a lot. What if I'm one of those? But if you read it as 90% chance of success, that's pretty cool. Yeah, sounds like these guys know what they're doing, right? That's how our intuitive thinking reacts to that. So that is essentially quantitative gains or losses. They're the same because what they've done is they've taken this reference point, some reference point, which is 100 in this case, and they have used that to frame these two options differently. Please go ahead, Sia.
Question, yes. Is this ethical? Like, is it ethical to give people bloody 10% of something? How can you even understand this, on a human level? So I'm also kind of curious, how does this
I think
come down to the area of ethics?
So yes, great question. I'm not sure if this exact example here is something that's in the real world or it's just an example.
I think it's pretty possible, yeah.
It's probably just an example.
Very realistic. Yeah.
No, but I wouldn't be surprised if, it's a consent form and consent forms are meant to inform you about the risks of the procedure you're going to undertake. I wouldn't be surprised if there exist these kinds of forms. But great question. I don't know, to be honest.
Yeah.
If it's real.
I'm feeling very, very warm to this because yesterday I was looking at, I decided to get insurance, comprehensive health insurance.
Yes.
And then they sent me this document with what you get under each policy. And I'm reading through and I cannot comprehend all of that. It's just impossible to read. It's like legal documents are designed to screw you up, which just, for me, it's really painful.
No, I totally agree. I think those guys, they don't have any understanding yet of behavioral economics and stuff. Most large companies haven't even begun to implement behavioral economics. Forget behavior design. They are very far. We're at the very beginning. So that's why I'll recommend a couple of books today, which tell you some of the leading organizations. But it's happening. There's more and more of that. And I think, go ahead, Jamie.
As far as when the legal document goes, it's a classic case of technical jargon.
Yes.
Profession, every kind of profession sort of field has this. You get to the levels of expertise. Intentionally, new words are invented, terms, and like its entire lingo is designed to be for insiders to even decipher. And I can't recall who it was. Some well, I know some people have looked at this and like translated, done like writing exercises to translate I guess a piece of technical jargon can be translated into like very simple English.
Yes.
Like in the case, like the document with
exactly. I was coming to this, saying almost the same thing. Was that there is the organization employing lawyers to deliberately confuse you, and there's the other case of them employing behavioral scientists to inform you or help you. Those are two different cases. Jamie is definitely talking about the latter or the former. Yes, Philippe.
To be fair, in a lot of cases, it's not to screw us up in order to confuse us, but sometimes it's because the people who are coming with such documents and coming with the informations are looking only from their own perspective without looking at what customer needs and how the customer understands things. So they're just looking from their own expertise without putting themselves and using empathy in this way in order to put it in a very like easy to consume way.
Yeah, they definitely don't have that training either, and they work with the law. That's the world they know.
Yeah, and also in that world, also going to protect themselves from other lawyers coming in to,
Right, exactly. Excellent.
Yeah, there's a company in Helsinki, I found it last year, that deals with legal design. And I was so happy seeing that they designed these documents where you can easily find the information you need to see as the person who's in question, basically. It's so lovely.
Adoptive.
Yeah.
And there's more and more. Exactly. Those are the professions where this stuff is super needed. But if you could share some of the lack of behavioral economics thinking, lack of nudge thinking, etc., in that insurance example you had, that would be amazing, because now we can start looking at the best way to learn this subject is to look where it applies in your life, day-to-day life, and analyze it. Philippe.
I have one comment. It's almost like in Denmark, there has been a vaccination introduced for older people, but the information flow was simply so bad because no one took real consideration how older people are using the computer and internet in order to find the information. So there was so much confusion created, and people started like losing their queues and the placed in queues. So there was a lot of chaos involved in that, only because there hasn't been taken like consideration of how all the people are using the computer and how the information should be delivered or shown to people in order for them to consume it easily.
Yes. You guys, gonna jump into this. Continue. Just stop me if you need something. Another discussion here. So these are the new course prices for the next round of this course. I did some, research and came up with a new set of prices. I just wanted to discuss how you think anchoring and framing is working here. Yeah, I'm not asking you to analyze the course, the numbers themselves, but I just took that as an example to talk about how what we just learned about could be working here. Any thoughts? Just free discussion.
So the obvious is show the original price, kind of, or even if it's imaginary higher number, kind of just slap it in to make it softer that something costs more than 1,000 euros, for example.
No. I'm talking about
what do you mean?
How can we apply what we learned about prospect theory to analyzing this? So what does prospect theory, what are the three things it says? What's the first one? Reference point.
Well, there's early bird, non-early bird. That's, I think, kind of.
The first thing prospect theory tries to remind us that we are always looking at something from a reference point, right? Okay, so let's look at this from that point of view. What's the reference point here?
I guess the individual.
Yes, that's right. Interestingly, prospect theory said that the reference point is the first piece of information that you get. For example, the thing that's highlighted on the menu of the restaurant, or the first cup you see, you judge everything based on that. But it need not necessarily be the first that is presented to you. It's the first that you think of, because when you look at this menu, list of prices, you look at, what's applicable to me? You first think of, I am an individual. It's going to cost me 3,000 euros. That becomes your reference point. And everything else you start looking at from that reference point. So an early bird, you start looking at from that 3,000 euros and say, it's just half the price, not too shabby. Right? Or, it's something for groups. So I just wanted to show this as an example to show that the reference point is one of those things we try to instinctively hone in on it. Because why? We have incomplete information to make a decision. How on earth can you be doing all the homework to find out if this course is worth 3,000 or 30,000 or 300? It's arbitrary when it comes to price, because the value that you place on it and the price that the course is asking, those two are not correlated. There's no relationship between them. You only know what beer should cost because you have been drinking beer every day, or you've been drinking beer for a long time. So if I say I'm offering a 30 euro pint, you're going to be like, what, 30 bucks? Ash, are you crazy? What have you put in it? Right? That's a high quality. Why? Because you have a reference point that beer usually costs, if you live in the Nordics, something like anything from 7 to 10 and more in a pub. That's why you think 30 is expensive. So we actually, as human beings, we don't have any way to objectively assess qualitative value. And so when you're talking about a new category like Tom, for example, Tom is building an interesting app for balancing life. New category. It's an entirely new category. What's the reference point? How do I value that as a user? Is it worth subscribing to the app for 10,000 euros a year because it saves my life, or is it only worth 10 euros? I don't know. That's the problem with products that try to create new categories. There are no reference points, and therefore establishing a reference point is going to be very critical in your pricing. Just an example, right, of application of prospecting. Then the final one was loss aversion. We'll read more about this later.
Add something to that. To the last. Just jump back a second.
Yes.
So one thing I thought for that would take advantage of the anchoring effect even more so is aligning it with what you would see, how you read the page.
Yes.
And just the first numbers you're exposed to.
Yes.
So the individual price was the first price seen.
Mm-hmm.
And that anchor would be 30.75.
Exactly.
Where vice versa, as it stands now, the first number that my brain processed was 14.75, and then it's kind of going up. So you're either anchoring on one side of the spectrum or the other. Whatever's.
I'm actually arguing a little bit, but I cannot be sure because it's just a claim that actually even though it's presented this way, that's why I showed this example. Even though it's presented this way, you're actually anchoring on the individual price because that's your life situation. So you anchor based on what your reality is. So if you go into if you go into a mall and you see a list of prices, I'm not sure about this, but let's see. I'm just trying to think through this. But if you go into a mall, you see a list of prices, and one of them is for parents and kids, right? You may anchor off of that because you have a child, because it's the most relevant to you. Well, I think you're probably closer to the truth than I am. But I also felt in this example that we are like Philippe said, you anchor off the individual price and say, well, it's going to be 3,000 if I take it on my own. Why don't I bring someone else? Or why don't I get the early bird, you see? So these seem cheaper based on that anchor price. It's a bit like that mug example, you know? So that's a great point, Jamie. And I really think the presentation matters. And I also think it's a bit tricky to flip them around, you see? And if I had the individual first and had the early bird at the corner, it would somehow seem also a bit kind of weird.
Yeah, for sure. There's like multiple angles to it. There's like the
exactly
element to it.
That's
like
where
you said, there's that alignment with the group. You can anchor to like, you know, oh, this is what group I belong to, and then you know, using that to compare to the others.
Exactly.
And so it's like all of these like heuristics are just like running in our brain. Boom,
exactly.
boom. It's like
time of day, context, time of day, Mac learners, Mac versus PC. So anytime you have choices and decision making, you have these principles working. Okay, happy to talk about it as much as we need. It's perfect you brought up the word heuristic, because this is another key thing in this whole behavioral economics and behavior design. Heuristic and bias are two sides of the same thing. And this is something that a lot of people get confused. You read the anchoring heuristic, or this heuristic or that heuristic, and then you read the anchoring bias, then you read the anchoring effect. They're all pretty much interrelated. A heuristic is a rule of thumb, or it's a mental shortcut. That's why when UX designers do a heuristic analysis, what does it mean? It means that you're an expert and you will just use your rules of thumb, these shortcuts that you picked up over time, that, well, if there's more than 80 items on the page, it's too much information, reduce the items. You know that as an expert. Or if you click a button and it takes 10 seconds to load, this site is too slow. You gotta speed up the site. These are all heuristical things. It's not objective truth, but you just know it as rule of thumb. Now, the interesting thing about behavioral economics is the same rules of thumb that we use to make decisions are the biases that come back to haunt us. They coexist. Now, this is super useful to make that decision, right? It's also a decision-making tool. By using the heuristic of anchoring and saying, let's go. I think this individual is so much. Let's go with the early bird. I'll save money. It actually works. You do save money. But that mental shortcut can also, when seen negatively, can become a bias. This is a very subtle thing which I want to put in here. It's something we'll explore more, but it's something you should kind of get the hang of and start to see. These two things are not separate. And that's why any book or article which talks about heuristics and biases, Wikipedia articles, these are good to read because they talk about it in this nuanced way. They talk about both sides of the same coin. Now let's listen to Senor himself to tell us a little bit more about heuristics. Oh, shucks, I don't have these videos. Sorry.
In our paper, we described three major heuristics of judgment, and we spoke of representativeness, which is the kind of judgment that's where you judge probability by similarity, and we spoke of availability, which is when you make a judgment of probability or of frequency by the ease with which instances come to mind. And then we had a third process, which I now think of differently from the way we did then, which is known as anchoring, which is that if we plant an idea in your head or a number in your head, it has a very big effect on subsequent judgments. Well, I'll give you an example from recent research, not ours actually. I think it's research by Tim Wilson and some colleagues. They asked people, please write down the last 4 digits of your social security number. So they write that number. Then you ask them, think of the number of physicians in Manhattan. Do you think that the number of physicians in Manhattan is larger or smaller than the number you just wrote down? So they do that. And then you ask them, what's your best guess about the number of physicians in Manhattan? Well, it turns out that the best guesses are highly correlated with people's social security number. Yeah, that's anchoring. And, you know, there are different ways to think about it, but what happens probably is you have made it easy, you have forced people to consider that number as a possible answer. And they've tried to make sense of, could it be true, could it be false? And in trying to make sense of a large number, of a small number, they have influenced their own judgment about it. And so when they're asked, what is your guess, you produce an effect. So we, our demonstration, which is quite well known actually, because it was in that 1974 paper. It's the only thing we actually ever wrote on anchoring. It's, I think, 1 paragraph in the science paper. But we had that experiment where we showed people a wheel of chance, which was actually rigged, I confess, and it stopped at a certain number between 0 and 100. And then we asked people, look at this number, do you think, which could be, say, either 15 or 65, what do you think is the percentage of nations in the UN that are from Africa? Is it higher or lower than that number? And then estimate the number of African nations in the UN. It had a very big effect. So that's a demonstration of anchoring.
Crazy, totally crazy. I mean, these guys have done such examples, experiments around the age of Gandhi, for example, and said, do you know if Gandhi lived more than 80, or like given people a random number and then ask them Gandhi's age, and people fit in 2 different groups who are given 2 different numbers, they think Gandhi's age was quite close to the number that they were initially given. So this kind of tendency to anchor and use a reference point, super strong. I want to show you one more. Again, how common is this? Like I showed you before, behavioral science has a replication problem. This is another effect. That we send to
and saying, this child talks like a little lawyer. It was looking at a child and saying, this child talks like a little lawyer. And noticing that if you were asked, what is this child going to be, you know, when she grows up? You'll want to say she'll be a lawyer. And that's representativeness in a nutshell. That is, it's talks like a lawyer. You see a similarity, and then you jump to the conclusion that this, yes, this is a likely outcome. We do that a lot. You know, you see, one of the important things that the President of the United States does is walk to and from his helicopter. And now if he strides confidently to the helicopter, and they all try to do that, that expresses leadership and strength and confidence and so on. You know, you couldn't imagine somebody kind of shuffling to his helicopter. You know, it would destroy his credibility. Now, why would it destroy his credibility? You know, it's complete nonsense. But you have to act like a leader. You have to look like a leader. This is part of leadership. And for people, it's associated with predicting that somebody is good or not good at the job. Now, this is in some ways truly nonsensical. But we can't help it, so that's how we think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I hope those videos give you a little bit of a clue into this whole kind of space. There's a lot to discover there. And so the prospect theory, and there's one thing I have to say, thinking fast and slow, Kahneman came up with the two systems, the system 1 and system 2, which is the cognitive side of the work. Remember, he's a psychologist, but won the economics Nobel because the work got applied into economics. The system 1 and 2 is something that I will talk about in the next class. But prospect theory runs pretty deep. These ideas of anchoring, these ideas of representation, these ideas of loss aversion and stuff like that. So the book that I would recommend to read about biases is actually a book by this guy called Rolf Dobelli. It's called The Art of Thinking Clearly. I'll share these books again, as I said. Terrific little book. It's conversational and it goes into all these interesting biases and how they work with real nice examples. And it's definitely been easily one of my favorite books. This is the other resource. Some of you know this, the Cognitive Bias Codex. It's free online. I'll again share this as well. But it's a good kind of like breakdown of different types of cognitive biases. And the more you read them, the more you read about prospect theory, you'll start to get a hang of how all of this stuff kind of works and how to use it, basically. It's impossible just to master these and be like, hey man, tell me how this works, and it pops out of your mouth. It's just not possible. But you can learn how to find the information you need when you use them. We still have to get into nudging. So we got a bit delayed today. Is it okay if I pull another 20 minutes?
Unfortunately not available. I need to go now.
Okay. Same?
Yeah.
Okay. Let's get into nudging in the next class. No problem. And if it's possible, or should I record this and you guys watch it later? If someone else wants to stay. Yeah? All right. All right. Because this is it's a continuous piece. And I think it's important I get it done because I would like you guys to have this covered before before the next class, which is 2 classes away, 2 weeks away. The break will be too long. Excellent. Thanks, guys. Sorry for all the snafu. Next time I'll have everything set up and I'll make sure it just goes smoothly and record the whole thing. Thanks.
No worries, I've been there.
Recover.
Thank you, Ashwin.
Take care. Thanks for your participation. Bye, guys. So yeah, to continue, what happened so far? We had bounded rationality with Herbert Simon. He came up with the idea of satisficing. Then we had Kahneman build on that. He actually built on bounded rationality and developed prospect theory. And many years after prospect theory was written, an economist called Richard Taylor, he was just unhappy with economics as it was. And he stumbled into Kahneman and Tversky, the partner, 2 researchers, they were working on prospect theory. And he said, man, this is the theory that explains all this weird stuff that's happening in economic behavior that I've been trying to talk about, but nobody's listening to me. And so he came up, essentially, the idea of behavioral economics was around even before, but he came up with the concept of nudge. It was actually suggested to him by someone else. They said, why don't you call this nudge? The papers that Taylor wrote, they didn't even get published. They were not accepted by any important journal. They were like, this is not interesting. Finally, a small journal decided to publish nudge. Small publication decided to publish it, and he basically ended up creating an entire field called behavioral economics. Insane. But to jump on what nudge is, because we have these systematic errors that we make. We have a certain way of making decisions. We look at reference points or anchors. We are averse to losses. We don't feel gains like the same. Our sensitivity to gains goes down. All this behavioral stuff is how we make decisions. Taylor said, why don't we design environments that support those decisions? He took it into the design domain, being an economist still, and said, these environmental factors that help you make these decisions based on your weaknesses, based on your biases, based on your heuristical style of thinking, let's call these nudges. So a nudge is any aspect of choice architecture that alters behavior in a predictable way without forbidding any actions or significantly changing the economic incentives. And to count as a mere nudge, the intervention must be easy and cheap to avoid. So there's a few things here, right? One is this word choice architecture, which you will get more and more familiar with, how to architect choices. The other is it should be kind of predictable. It should work repeatedly. It shouldn't forbid any options. That's a very key thing about nudge, which a lot of people don't yet realize. You actually don't remove any options. You retain all the options, but you change how you present them. You change the architecture of choices, or you architect choices in such a way that without significantly changing the economic incentives, without punishing people, without prohibiting stuff, and it should be easy and cheap to avoid. There's no compulsion. So it's a very political, the very politically conscious approach. They call it libertarian paternalism and so on. There's a huge debate about how liberal it is and so on. But basically the idea is that you make it easy, make it without putting pressure, without coercing or punishing people, you help them do the right thing. And so the good thing is that nudge, all of the theory, the books, the practice has all been around nudge for good. Most of nudge people work in health and things like housing or medicine, stuff like really in cause-related work. But as you can see, more and more, it's starting to move into design, products, marketing, and corporate sector. So I have a number of examples. I'll go through a few of them really quickly, just to give you a sense. American grocery store placed green arrows on the floor, leading to the fruit and veg aisles. Simple nudge, not really changing anything, not even taking away the options, just placing a path to the healthy stuff. Really good example. This is the anchoring effect. When eating out, you'll see one item which is more expensive than anything else on the menu. They don't expect you to buy that, but then they expect you to buy items that are less expensive than that because you anchor off of that. That's why you go to, let's say, a Michelin star restaurant and you say, wow, 250 euros for the steak. Damn, cool. So then I'll get like 125. And I'm not, you justify the price that you spend based on the anchor. That's, I don't know how ethical that nudge is, but it's there. This is an interesting one. In a UK scheme, where each home will be given 2 separate bins for their garbage. One is for regular waste, the other is for recyclable. The recyclable bin is a little bit bigger, however. That's smart. And hope that by limiting the space for the general waste, people will recycle more. I don't know if that works, but it is nicer that you have a little bit more space in recycle, but when people start shoving all the non-recyclable stuff into it as well, interesting intervention. But again, as you can see, very gentle. Organ donation, very famous example, opt-in, opt-out, basically, where you actually have to opt in countries where people automatically enrolled in organ donation schemes and have to opt out, only about 10 to 15% of people bother, and therefore you have many more organ donors. So just make it the default. Defaults is one of the principles of choice architecture, which I will go into in the next class. But basically, people go with the default, and if you say, well, by default, you're an organ donor, people don't take the effort to change it. But if they have to tick to be an organ donor, the number of donors come down. People were given money to, provide smokers with a savings account. At the end of this period, they had a urine test, and if they passed, they got their money. Otherwise, all the money was given to charity. Strong loss aversion and endowment effect. We can get into endowment effect later, but basically, given something, whoops, you're going to take it away. Oh no, you never had the money in the first place, but still, it feels like you have it, and now you don't want to lose it. And finally, something like social norms, where 9 out of 10 people in your area are up to date with tax payments, also called social proof, things like people who bought this book also bought. You're trying to go to a software and it's used by employees and companies at Google and Stripe and blah, blah. Using social norms to nudge people. Lots of great examples in the world out there, just to start. I had to throw this in there because it's tricky, because Philippe had said, is it just me? Quite many channels on a Slack. I'm feeling nudged to close my Slack. So that's an interesting use of nudge, right? I honestly don't have an answer. I thought we should put it there as a critical exercise. Like the number of notifications are not actually inviting Philippe, they're preventing him. They're doing the opposite. So when something prevents you from doing something, is that a nudge or is it something else? Because nudge basically says it shouldn't forbid any options. So it's a thought experiment. There's no, but as I said, we are behavior designers, and for us, definitely that's part of our subject matter. We don't, only nudge theory says we shouldn't forbid, but behavior design doesn't say we should forbid. We are for our methodology toolkit is everything. We take everything as long as it's ethical. We can use whatever we want, whatever works. So just jump in. I'm just going through these because I have lots of these. Again, I looked at Canva, very interesting. Now in software, you can start looking at nudges more carefully. I also got the premium of Canva today, and fantastic monetization design. They let you use the software, build a lot of stuff, and then slowly start monetizing. You say, pay me €1 for that to remove a watermark. And today, to download with some premium designs, they let me add the premium designs with the watermark. And then they said, well, now that you have these, your design is complete, right? Now, how can you go back and start thinking of, how do I change this with another free design? Do you want to pay and download instead? In any case, I've used them so much that I was happy to pay, but I thought that was a really nice nudge. When it's not a nudge is when, this is also a nudge, you log into PayPal online, and then it tries to tell you to go mobile with the payments and kind of send the app link. It doesn't know that I already have the app somehow. But if you don't make this not now, the opt-out really clear, even here, download a free watermark draft, it's not clear enough. So they're not really nudges because they are forcing you to some extent. So be sure that if you're talking about a nudge, make sure you're giving the opt-out, you're not closing any options, and you're making the path super, super clear as an optional path. Cool. Excellent. Now it's just the last piece. What about the limits of nudging? You'll learn about them over time, and we'll go into them over time for sure. But one of the key things is they do this. Nudge is almost completely focused on changing the environment. They're not very much on the cognitive side. They're not very much on the human side. Motivations, why do we do what we do? Culture, huge, right? Culture, such a huge driver of behavior. Lots and lots of reasons on the subjective side. They focus on things like change the can, change the form, give people money, change the ale, you see? And why? Because they already have these principles that people behave in these ways, people satisfies, people do this, people are affected by loss. They take principles and they apply them to context. That's the nudge approach. And you do experiments. But we are interested in this part. And that's why it's very, very important to include not just nudge approaches, but also include cognitive science and the other approaches that we have been looking at in the previous class. I want to show you a quick video of the last video, very short, from Rory Sutherland, who's a very entertaining character and a great speaker and fun guy. But he's one of the leading nudge guys, nudge proponents and consultants globally for Ogilvy and for O&M, Ogilvy and Mather.
This is my first time at TED. Normally, as an advertising man, I actually speak at TED Evil, which is TED's secret sister organization that pays all the bills. It's held every 2 years in Burma. And I particularly remember a really good speech by Kim Jong-il on how to get teens smoking again. But actually, it's suddenly come to me after years working in the business that what we create in advertising, which is intangible value, you might call it perceived value, you might call it badge value, subjective value. Intangible value of some kind gets rather a bad rap. If you think about it, if you want to live in a world in the future where there are fewer material goods, you basically have two choices. You can either live in a world which is poorer, which people in general don't like, or you can live in a world where actually intangible value constitutes a greater part of overall value. That actually intangible value in many ways is a very, very fine substitute for using up labor or limited resources in the creation of things. Here's one example. This is a train which goes from London to Paris. The question was given to a bunch of engineers about 15 years ago, how do we make the journey to Paris better? And they came up with a very good engineering solution, which was to spend £6 billion building completely new tracks from London to the coast and knocking about 40 minutes off a 3.5-hour journey time. Now, call me Mr. Picky, I'm just an ad man, but it strikes me as a slightly unimaginative way of improving a train journey merely to make it shorter. Now, what is the hedonic opportunity cost of spending £6 billion on a load of railway tracks? Here's my naive advertising man's suggestion. What you should in fact do is employ all of the world's top male and female supermodels, pay them to walk the length of the train handing out free Chateau Petrus for the entire duration of the journey. Now, you'll still have about £3 billion left in change, and people will ask for the trains to be slowed down. Now,
I love that. It's so funny, right? And it's really entertaining, and that's a classic entertaining / media advertising type nudge. And he's one of the leading proponents of nudge today, who picked it up from the behavioral economists, and they have a roaring, massive business in helping companies make nudges. Now, but if you look at that example he gave, really cool example, and actually it makes a lot of sense when you listen to it. Like, wow, why are you spending money reducing the time? Change the experience. People will actually want to be in the train longer, right? Fantastic, super nice. But reality is like, no, there's a lot of assumptions built into that idea which does not correlate with reality. One is, first of all, it considers only present costs. So when you say something is cheaper now, you have something called present bias, which tends to value the present over the future. Typically, present bias works in everything from having that chocolate now to having those extra drinks to postponing, working this weekend. It's like you value the present more. It's like, yeah, the future, I will be good in the future, but right now I need to enjoy this. I deserve it. And this whole thing of, it's cheaper now to just cut the cost of building better infrastructure and use it in some other way. Not very smart. The long-term costs of those things also need to be considered. The more cognitive side is, it assumes that all people in the group will behave the same, that they're motivated by the same things. How do you know that someone on the train doesn't need to go see their sick mother, or someone on the train needs to go to a business meeting? Do you think everyone on the train from London to Paris would be happy to drink Chateau Petrus and look at hot supermodels and just chillax? No, people's motivations and goals in context are just magnificently different. Nope, that solution's not going to work for a lot of people. So, but speeding up the train, I think it's going to work for everybody. No one's going to be hurt by being a bit early, right? It just makes you more efficient. That's why certain things work in a certain way, because they actually have real impact. So also this idea assumes that people respond to the same incentives. And also there's not much of an experimental thought. He's just giving you an idea, but he's not thought of, should we go and sample a small, experimentation is all about sampling. You take the whole population size, okay, this entire train full of people, let's go and ask 10 people randomly what they think about this idea, or what are their motivations for being on this train, right? It's not a very experimental approach. So there's a lot of stuff in the world out there that goes under the name of nudge that doesn't have deeper thinking. And I think that's the message here. Quickly wanted to close with a couple of these kinds of behavior change frameworks. You see, this is from Sue Academy. I have no idea what's going on with this framework. Insight, why behavior occurs, intervention, what to make. impact, how to make it work, and then implement how to make it grow. It sounds nice, but really, like, are they leveraging any real behavioral insights in there? Are they applying any theory? Do they have a theory? Do they have a hypothesis? Do they have evidence? Nope, I don't think so. And this is how the industry does it. This is how behavioral economics does it. You take the current state, you take some behavioral economics principles, those principles give you those implications, you ideate, and then you come to the ideal future state, right? This is the classic. So these principles of loss aversion and this and that are supposed to give us the gospel, the commandments of how to change behavior. So you simply apply them. But the fact is, no, we need to go deeper into the human psychology. We need to understand why people do things. And that's why we have this. We have other lenses. It's not just behavioral economics. We think in terms of culture, neuroscience, computational science, and cognitive psychology. The other last thing about behavioral economics, this problem is that it's license to experiment. I'll go into it the next time. But pretty much, I think we're done. This is a recommended book inside the Nudge unit. I'll drop it there, especially for people in policy like Ines. And there's been a new couple of words recently, sludge, which is this dark patterns. Manipulative nudges are called sludges, and Taylor himself has come up with it, so that's really good. And snudge is self-nudging, which is super nice. Like, how can we design interventions? So I really recommend reading Taylor. He's the original stuff and got lots of good stuff. And I'll cover some of these examples, etc., in the next class. That's about it for today. Yeah, but any questions or comments and so on, just shoot. I have time, so no rush.
No comments from here. It's some good stuff.
Excellent.
I really like the last two neologisms from Taylor.
Yes.
Sounds really interesting. The dark pattern and the self-nudging. Very useful.
Yes. Dark patterns are, there's some good articles about dark patterns of UI, but I'm really happy that it's showing up in the nudge literature as well. Haven't read the new Cass Sunstein book about too much information. That's something I look forward to reading, but I think that's right on the edge of the science.
Yeah, the self nudges, snudges are real interesting. Applying it to, it feels like that's a good use versus the dark pattern.
Yes.
Because you're doing it for, supposedly good reasons.
I think it might be useful to read the Snatch if you would like to know a little bit more about, like, for example, habit architecture and stuff like that.
Yeah, definitely. Oh, and also did like his TED Talk, the TED Talk you showed, where he's come up with that solution where you could really, there's a lot of things like this. You could invest billions of dollars literally to make a more efficient system, to build something better. And it's like, well, there's ways you could enhance the experience, like, that is not purely the thing that changes our perception of the whole thing, like much more. Yeah,
the principles are absolutely there. There's no doubt about that, which is that and like he said, the perceived value, right? What you pay and what you experience, these things are just, there's no way to correlate them. And that's the zone of behavioral economics. It's not economics, it's behavioral economics.
Right.
Fun.
Not rational.
Not rational. Bounded rational. So yeah, I just wanted to do a couple of things. One was like, super nice if you could, in order to refresh your memories of what was done, I think it's better the sooner you do your homework and drop it there. So during the rest of the week, you also have some time to converse around it and not wait till the very end. And also, I just put this up saying, there could be more discussion and collaboration. Basically, the channel is there for you guys to use. Now you're starting to get into the theories and the specific topics. If you find something in triggers, if you find something in motivation, you want to talk about it, throw it to the triggers channel. There's no protocol. They're just there for you to use, but it's just there as categories, so it helps you think and discuss. Happy to, put books, articles, whatever you find, or even thoughts from the course. And I think the more collaboration there is towards working on these things, the better. Anyways, this is something I will anyway start to push a bit more now. But yeah. Cool. Awesome. Thanks for staying, guys. And half an hour more. We'll keep it more tight the next time. But now we have 2 weeks break. Hopefully see you on Slack. Let's keep this conversation warm, especially those biases and stuff. There's lots of interesting stuff. If you visit the Slack every day once and just refresh yourself on what's going on with this topic, then you'll be quite warm in 2 weeks. But I'll also send you some homework, of course, to keep you warmed up, and see you on Slack.
Great. Thanks, you guys.
One more thing about
Sure.
I think the ASMR sound that Philip mentioned, maybe it's coming from like your headset,
cable.
like banging, like the
The
cable.
cable.
was-
Yeah, exactly. I was thinking about it as well.
Mine?
Yeah,
Yeah, I
from the
think so.
headphones.
Really, it could be.
Yeah, exactly this sound.
That's crazy because I don't hear anything.
Because when you are moving your hands, sometimes
I'm so
the
sorry.
sound was accelerating a little bit.
Good to know. Thanks. Next time I'll try to do something about that.
Just put
I
some
think if you wrap it
some
like
piece of cloth
behind
or
yourself
something.
or something, that might. Yeah.
Or
I
just
don't know.
put something soft under the table where it has a connection with the table.
Right on. How's it now?
It's perfect.
See, I changed. It was just hanging off the edge of the table, and I gave it a bit of support now, and it's already better. Well, I'll test it next time before the next class. Thanks for that.
Sure.
And have a great Easter holiday. Yeah.
Thanks, you too,
yeah.
guys.
We've all been working really hard. Let's get a break.
Enjoy some
Take
time
care.
off.
Indeed.
Yep.
Take some
Yeah.
time.
Take care,
Take
guys.
care, guys.
Bye bye.
Bye.
Bye. Bye, Katie. See you.